Papua New Guinea, Milne Bay. August 25, 1942, 11 o'clock at night. The Japanese tanks are moving. Not fast, the jungle does not move fast. But moving, grinding forward through mud. That is not mud in the ordinary sense, but something alive, something deliberate. The kind of mud that grabs at a boot and does not release it. That swallows vehicles to their axles and fills a man's lungs when he falls face first into it. The tanks are moving anyway, because Japanese tanks have never stopped for anything as irrelevant as terrain. Because the men riding behind these tanks have never been stopped by anything at all. Because in 7 months of Pacific warfare, 7 months of every Allied force, the world could throw at them, the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force has never lost a land battle. Not once, not a position, not a ridgeline, not a beach. They expect this to take 2 days. They expect the airstrip to be theirs by morning. They expect the Australians defending it to behave the way every other defending force has behaved when the tanks appeared at night, and the bugles started, and the darkness filled with soldiers who did not know how to stop. What they do not expect is what is waiting for them in the mud. What is waiting for them in the mud is a group of young men from Melbourne and Brisbane and Adelaide who have been described by their own generals as not ready for this, who have been called by the veterans who trained alongside them chocolate soldiers who are about to hand the Japanese Empire the first land defeat it has suffered in this war. To understand what happened at Milne Bay, you first have to understand what Japan had become in the Pacific. In December 1941, Japan struck Pearl Harbor, crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single Sunday morning, and then turned the full weight of its military machine on every Allied position between Hawaii and India. What followed was not a military campaign. It was a consumption. Wake Island fell in 15 days. Guam in 3. Hong Kong in 18. The Philippines, where MacArthur himself commanded, were taken in 5 months. Singapore, the fortress, the Gibraltar, the place that was never supposed to fall, fell in 7 days. In every engagement on every island, against every Allied force sent to stop them, the Japanese had won. Not barely, not through superior numbers alone. Won with a ferocity and tactical precision that left Allied commanders staring at their maps in genuine confusion, searching for the mistake they had made, the position they had misread, the moment when the thing that was supposed to hold had simply failed to hold. The unit at the sharp end of this machine, the force that had taken beach after beach, airfield after airfield, the soldiers that other Japanese soldiers measured themselves against, was the Kaigun Tokubetsu Rikusentai, the Special Naval Landing Force, Japan's elite naval infantry. They had participated in the taking of Shanghai. They had stormed Guam. They had been part of the wave that broke Malaya. Their record was not a record of battles. It was a record of facts. And every fact said the same thing. Wherever they went, they won. By August 1942, this force was preparing to add one more insignificant airstrip to a list of insignificant airstrips that stretched across the Pacific like a chain of certainties. The place was called Milne Bay. The eastern tip of Papua New Guinea juts into the Coral Sea. like something that has not quite decided whether it belongs to the land or the water. The bay itself is enormous, roughly 30 kilometers of coastline, curving around deep anchorage that any naval planner could see was valuable. Everything else about the place was hostile in ways that do not show up on the maps that naval planners use. Milne Bay receives more rainfall than almost anywhere else on Earth. Not seasonal rainfall, not monsoon rainfall, constant, relentless structural rainfall. Rain that falls for so many days in succession that the jungle floor does not drain, cannot drain, and transforms the ground into something that has no clean geological name, but that soldiers who fought there would describe in language stripped of all euphemism as the worst ground any human being has ever been asked to fight on. The coconut plantations that line the coast turned the rain into permanent darkness at ground level, a canopy so dense that daylight was a gray approximation of what it was supposed to be, and nighttime was an absence so complete that a man could not see his own hand held in front of his face. The Japanese intelligence assessment of Milne Bay described it as lightly held by a small Australian garrison. The intelligence assessment was wrong. By August 1942, roughly 8,000 Australians were stationed at Milne Bay, most of them there to build and defend. The airstrip that both sides understood was the reason anyone was there at all. Most of them were militia. This requires a pause, because the word militia does not carry the weight it should in the Australian military story of 1942. The Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, the professional soldiers, the veterans of Tobruk and the Western Desert, were the soldiers that the generals trusted. Battle-hardened, experienced men who had already looked at a German tank and decided what they thought about it. The militia were something different. They had been raised for home defense. They had trained on rifles that were sometimes older than their fathers. They had never been to war. Their average age was somewhere. That made experienced soldiers quietly uncomfortable when they thought about it. The 18th Brigade and the 7th Brigade, who would defend Milne Bay, contained men from both categories. Some AIF veterans rotated into the garrison, and a substantial core of militia soldiers who had not yet been tested and whose senior commanders were not fully confident they could be. General MacArthur, who commanded Allied forces in the Pacific Theater from his headquarters, in a city that was not under immediate threat, had written a report several weeks earlier, assessing the militia's combat value. The assessment was not favorable. MacArthur believed that the militia would not hold against a serious Japanese assault. The militia were about to prove him wrong. In the worst possible conditions that could have been chosen for the purpose, the Japanese plan for Milne Bay was the plan they always used, because it had always worked. Night landing, surprise. Tanks leading the advance along the coastal track. Infantry flooding behind. The defenders shocked and disorganized, facing armor in the dark with no counter, making the rational military calculation. That resistance was over before it had properly begun. 2 days, the airstrip. Move on. On the night of August 25th, approximately 2,000 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops came ashore at the eastern end of Milne Bay. In the darkness and the rain, They had tanks. They had mortars. They had the unbroken confidence of men who had never been beat and had no memory of what defeat felt like. What they did not have was accurate intelligence about the ground or an understanding of what the rain had done to it. And what they did not have, though they did not know this yet, was an enemy that was going to behave the way their previous enemies had behaved. The first contact came within hours of the landing. Australian outposts along the coastal track heard the tanks before they saw them, not the rumble of armor in the ways a European battlefield produces it, but a grinding, churning sound, mixed with the engine fighting the mud, and the crash of undergrowths being pushed aside in the dark. The outpost commanders made their reports. Japanese tanks moving west along the track. Estimated strength significant. Recommend withdrawal to the main perimeter. The recommendation was acknowledged. The perimeter was prepared. And then something happened that the Japanese tank commanders had not encountered before in this war. The Australians did not withdraw all the way to the perimeter. Small groups, sections of 8 or 10 men, militia soldiers, young men, who had been in the army for months, rather than years, fell back only far enough to let the tanks pass them in the dark. Then they came out of the jungle, behind the tanks, and killed the infantry following them. The tactic was not in any manual. It was not the result of sophisticated planning. It was the result of men who were frightened and wet and did not have the anti-tank weapons that would have made the correct tactic possible, looking at a situation that the correct tactic could not address, and doing the thing that was available to them. Instead, the Japanese infantry behind the tanks expected the Australians to be in front of them. They were not in front of them. They were beside them, behind them, in the coconut plantation, in the drainage ditches, in the water up to their chests, where the ground had flooded, and which the Japanese had not assessed as a position anyone would choose to occupy. The fighting that followed was not the kind of fighting that produces clear tactical accounts for historians to analyze later. It was the kind of fighting that happens in total darkness, in conditions that make every sense unreliable, where the mud sounds like footsteps, and the rain sounds like breathing, and the man 3 meters from you might be your corporal, or might be someone you are about to kill. And the only way to find out is to make a decision in the dark and live with it. Men fought with rifles used as clubs. When the bolt fouled with mud and the round would not chamber, they fought with entrenching tools. They fought with their hands, in ditches full of water, where 2 men had found each other. In the dark, and the fight was simply about which one was still above the surface when it was over. The tanks kept moving. The infantry behind them kept dying. For 3 days the Japanese advanced. Not quickly, not with the clean momentum of the Malaya campaign or the Singapore assault. Through mud that stopped even their tanks. Through rain that reduced visibility to the length of an arm. Through an enemy that refused to present itself in the way that an enemy is supposed to present itself. In front of you, fixed in a position, available to be broken and pushed back. This enemy was everywhere. It was in the trees. It was in the water. It was behind the position you had taken an hour ago and were sure you had cleared. The Japanese night attacks were the worst. This was the tactic that had broken every other force in the Pacific. The bugles, the screaming, the mass coming out of the dark. From every direction at once. The psychological machinery of a charge, designed to make a defending soldier's mind decide the situation was hopeless before his rifle had fired a single shot. The militia heard the bugles. They stayed in their positions. They had been told the Japanese would do this. They had been told it was a tactic, not a fact. They had decided to believe that. A corporal from Brisbane, 19 years old, holding a section of drainage ditch, with 6 men and a Bren gun, that was jamming every third round. Because of the mud, heard the bugle on the night of August 27th, and made a calculation that no military academy would have taught him to make. He waited until he could hear breathing. Then he opened fire. The section held, but the line was bending. By the 29th of August, Japanese pressure had pushed the defenders back toward the airstrip itself. The tanks had found firmer ground. The Japanese were within artillery range of the runway. In MacArthur's headquarters, the situation reports were producing the response that MacArthur's previous assessment had made predictable: doubt, skepticism, a reluctance to believe that the militia was performing as the reports claimed, because the reports claimed something that MacArthur had concluded was impossible. Messages went back and forth. MacArthur's staff questioned the numbers, questioned the assessments. The implication never stated directly, but present in every exchange, was that the ground commanders were misreading the situation, that the militia was not holding, that the reports of Japanese casualties could not be accurate. Major General Cyril Claus, commanding at Milne Bay, read these messages with the particular stillness of a man who is being told that what he can see with his own eyes is not happening. He sent a reply that was, by the standards of intercommand communication, extremely brief. He said, "I understand the situation. I will deal with it." Then he went back to running the battle. On the night of August 31st, Claus ordered the counterattack. Not a cautious probing advance, not a limited objective operation, designed to straighten a line. A counterattack, in the dark, in the rain, forward into the Japanese positions, with militia soldiers who had been fighting for 6 days on almost no sleep, whose uniforms had not been dry in a week, who had been eating cold rations in water-filled foxholes, and sleeping in the mud between attacks, and who now were being asked to stand up and go forward toward the tanks and the bugles, and the force that had never been defeated. They went. What happened on that coastal trek between the night of August 31st and the morning of September 5th has been described by the survivors in language that strips away everything that is not essential. No tactics, no formations. Moving forward through darkness, so complete that direction was maintained by the sound of the man in front of you and the feel of the track under your feet, contacting the Japanese in positions that could not be seen until you were in them, fighting for each position with whatever was in your hands, then moving to the next one. The rain was constant. The mud was constant. The dead were constant. Japanese and Australian both. face down in the coconut grove, half submerged in the drainage ditches, lying on the track, in the positions they had occupied when the decision was made for them. The Japanese counterattacked. The Australians held. The Japanese attacked again. The Australians held. Then the Australians attacked. And the Japanese, for the first time in this war, did not hold. It happened in the way that military breaking points always happen, not with a dramatic moment that can be pointed to, but with a gradual shift in the arithmetic of will versus cost. The Special Naval Landing Force had been told this operation would take 2 days. It had taken 12. They had been told they faced a lightly held position. The position had killed a third of their force. They had been told the Australians would not stand. The Australians had not only stood, they had come forward in the rain and taken back what had been lost. The Japanese commander assessed his position. He had no reinforcement coming. He had no artillery that could work in the terrain. He had tanks that were bogged, an infantry that was exhausted, and an enemy that had proven, against every assumption in his planning documents, that it could absorb what he gave it and continue advancing. On September 7, 1942, the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force began its withdrawal to the eastern end of the bay. On September 25th, the last Japanese soldiers were evacuated from Milne Bay by destroyer under cover of darkness. They left behind their dead and their equipment and something that could not be evacuated. They left behind their record. Imperial Japanese headquarters did not announce the defeat. There was no official communique, no acknowledgement that the Special Naval Landing Force had been pushed off a beach by an Australian militia garrison in conditions that their planning had described as acceptable. The battle was classified. The reports were filed in categories that kept them from the broader record. The officers who had commanded the operation were not publicly censured. That would have required public acknowledgement, but found their careers developing in the particular silence that military institutions reserve for men whose failures cannot be discussed. In Tokyo, the analysis that eventually made its way through the layers of institutional denial to something approaching the truth produced a conclusion that the strategists found difficult to process. The Australians had not won because of superior numbers. They had not won because of superior weapons. They had not won because of terrain. The terrain had been equally brutal for both sides. They had won because they had refused, in conditions that justified every rational case for withdrawal. To withdraw, the Special Naval Landing Force had encountered an enemy that did not respond to the psychological machinery that had broken every other enemy it had faced. The darkness did not break them. The tanks did not break them. The exhaustion and the hunger and the mud, and the rain and the 6 days without proper sleep, and the knowledge that they were militia, that the generals did not believe in them, that the official assessment of their worth was unfavorable. None of it broke them. And the Japanese strategic planners, staring at reports from a bay at the end of Papua New Guinea, understanding for the first time that the momentum they had assumed was permanent and absolute, had encountered something it could not move, wrote in language that they had not used before, about an Australian enemy that fought without the preconditions that other armies required for courage. No certainty of victory. No superiority of numbers. No clean ground and clear sight lines. Just mud and dark and the man beside you. And the decision made every time without discussion. That this position was not being given up today. MacArthur eventually acknowledged the victory. His statement described the outcome, in language calibrated to credit the command structure, rather than the soldiers in the drainage ditches. He noted the importance of air support and logistical factors, and the quality of the overall Allied response. He did not mention chocolate soldiers. The militia soldiers of Milne Bay came home to a country that was too relieved by the result to fully ask how it had been achieved. The newspapers ran the story. The victory was celebrated. First Allied land victory against Japan. The first time the advance had been stopped. The first crack in the record that had been unbroken since December. But the detail of who had done it. The young men with the jamming Bren guns. In the flooded ditches. The corporal from Brisbane, who waited until he could hear breathing. This detail was somewhere in the celebration, without quite being its center. The veterans of Milne Bay had the particular experience of all soldiers who do something that the people thanking them do not fully understand. You nod, you accept the handshake. You do not try to explain the mud. In the Japanese military archives, there is an assessment document from 1942 describing the factors that contributed to the Milne Bay withdrawal. Researchers who accessed it after the war noted that it contained a passage, unlike anything else in the Japanese military record of that period. The passage attempts to explain why the Special Naval Landing Force, a unit that had been operationally undefeated for the entire course of the Pacific War, had failed to take a single airstrip, defended by soldiers their own intelligence had categorized as second-rate. The explanation the document arrives at, after pages of operational analysis and logistical accounting and weather assessment, is short. Translated approximately, the enemy did not behave as expected. They were informed they were militia. They did not fight like militia. We do not have an explanation for this. The mud at Milne Bay is still there. The coconut plantation is still there. The drainage ditches. The coastal track where the tanks churned forward. In the dark on August 25th. And were still not where they needed to be. On September 7th, the rain still falls, with the consistency that makes Milne Bay one of the wettest places on the planet. It falls the same way it fell in 1942, without pause, without apology, onto a ground that absorbs everything and gives nothing back cleanly. It rained on the Japanese tanks. It rained on the Australian militia. It rained on the dead of both sides, in the ditches and the plantation, and on the track that everyone was fighting to control, because the airstrip at the end of it was the reason any of them were there. It rained the same on everyone. The difference was not the weather. The difference was not the weapons, or the training or the assessment that the generals had made before the battle started. The difference was what a 19-year-old from Brisbane decides to do when it is 3 a.m, and the ground is trying to swallow him, and the bugle is getting closer, and the man next to him looks at him in the dark and waits to see what he is going to do. What he does is stay. What he does is raise the rifle and wait until he can hear breathing and hold the line that everyone said he could not hold. What he does is win a battle that the most decorated naval infantry in the Pacific War could not take back from him. Japan had never lost a land battle. The mud knew otherwise. And the kid from Brisbane, standing in it,